I'm David Lombardo, and this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're joined in the studio by Dave Fleming, Legislative Director of the New York State Association of Cemeteries, who is here to talk about some of the after-death issues in the Empire State. Welcome back to the show, David.
Great to be back. Thank you.
So I want to start with a recurring issue, which is the upkeep of nonprofit local cemeteries. We've previously talked about the struggle to keep up with costs, the reliance on volunteers. What does the landscape look like in 2026?
Well, I wish I could say it's improved since the last time we were together, but it really hasn't. It's become much worse. The state has put in some regulations to help manage the process a little bit better when cemeteries are in trouble, and that's been somewhat successful. But the problem is that we have a really large number of cemeteries that are in significant decline financially. But let me also say that we have a ton of cemeteries in New York that are really well managed, doing very well, and are great, and they'll be around forever. But we have a lot of cemeteries, particularly small rural cemeteries upstate, that are facing significant challenges, which then become significant challenges for the localities, because under New York state law, if a cemetery fails, they become the wards of the municipality in which they're located, so they automatically become the responsibility of town boards and counties.
Well, what's the difference between a nonprofit cemetery that is doing okay financially and one that is either at the risk of becoming abandoned or has been abandoned? What is it like there, but the grace of God go I, or is there something that is demonstrably different about the situation in one versus the other?
Well, there are a whole host of factors, but most of them come to really location and investment by the communities generations and generations ago. So if you look at a New York City cemetery that's doing particularly well, you look at a Woodlawn or a Greenwood, they had folks who were, the historical figures of New York City who left large endowments, and they've done excellent jobs of managing those and have hundreds of millions of dollars to be able to operate the cemetery in perpetuity. Those are trust funds, so they have to just, utilize the interest. But real cemetery regulation and the requirement for permanent maintenance funds didn't go into effect in New York until 1949 after a report by the Attorney General at that time. And so when you look at historical cemeteries that have been around for a couple hundred years, if there was no significant investment in those cemeteries before 1949, you can imagine that those small investments that have been made since 1949 have not been sufficient in the marketplace that we find ourselves, where costs continue to increase, and it's significant. I will say, it's a respect thing for me when I meet with small cemeteries across upstate in particular, where they feel like their service is a community service. So they try to keep their prices as low as possible, the regulated nonprofits. So they don't, frankly, charge enough. And so we get in situations where, the graves are dramatically underpriced for what the maintenance is going to have to be for those nonprofits. And it causes significant long-term challenges when you have interest rates that are volatile. They're living off just the interest and the grave sales. And then at the same time, the other big factor is the fact that death care has completely changed in the last 20 years. You see such a massive rise in cremation. We have some of the highest rates in Western New York of cremation in the entire country. So more people being cremated, less being interred, and alternative forms of disposition of bodies, whether it be natural organic reduction or other things that are coming along that people are interested in doing.
And in terms of the state and its role in recent years, you mentioned regulations that's been adopted, but what have state policymakers done to try to backstop the situation, and what could they do in the future to provide additional support?
Well, two things. One, the regulations came from a whole host of issues that the New York State Association of Cemeteries brought up in legislation, which passed the legislature overwhelmingly and was vetoed under the last governor. But the veto message said we're going to be imposing regulations on the process. And those have been largely successful. So what those regulations do is that when the New York State Division of Cemeteries or the State Cemetery Board is aware that a regulated state cemetery is in financial trouble, they will immediately contact the municipality in which the cemetery is located and try to create an intervention, essentially, financially and operationally. If it's because they don't have enough people serving, try to get additional board members, talk about possible funding streams from a municipality. So obviously, from a local government's perspective, giving a nonprofit regulated cemetery, which is a quasi-government agency, they're permitted to give them money under the statutes. give them a little bit of money as opposed to taking them over completely. For a small town makes complete sense. And so we look at doing things like that. So those are very helpful. But really, a lot of it's also education. I speak at conferences across the state, whether it be for the Association of Towns or the clerks. We get some municipalities who are, my colleagues become a little too generous and want to jump in too quickly when a cemetery is in trouble and they take over a cemetery without following the process that's in statute. And that limits the access to funds for folks under the existing statute. So there is a fund established to help with the transition of cemeteries to local municipalities. That was expanded under work by the New York State Association of Cemeteries, and the legislature has been really supportive. But there is a process, and we need to make sure that folks follow that. Otherwise, they lose out on those revenue streams.
Are there any outstanding requests for state lawmakers and the governor as it pertains to supporting local cemeteries? Is there a wish list for some sort of recurring revenue stream or some other additional regulations that you're looking for?
So that's a great question, because we have had a revenue stream that everyone pays a little portion of their burial costs goes into the state abandoned and vandalism cemetery fund. And this will not shock your regular listeners who are, well aware of how New York operates. Under previous administrations, that fund kept being swept. So instead of being a trust fund, like cemeteries are required to have, about $15 million was swept out of that fund. The fund then became an allocation under the previous administration. It was $900,000 to cover all cemetery vandalism and abandonment in the state.
Did that keep up with the demand?
Not at all.
Yeah.
So we were successful in getting that amount raised to $2 million. What we've already seen this past year after the past budget cycle ended, we had already spent that money by the first quarter of the year. So we have ongoing discussions right now with legislative leaders, and particularly for the next budget cycle, to right-size that fund, which is not easy to do in a very difficult budget climate. But it is the people's responsibility and the people's money, in my mind. People have been giving money for decades to this fund. No longer exists. There is no trust fund. But we need to make sure we keep up with it. My biggest concern with that is that we have the largest number of pending state abandonments that I've seen in the 30 years that I've been doing this. And when you think, regulated cemetery abandonments, how big of a deal can that be? Think about the fact that you have a small municipality, say 5,000 people, that has, maybe 50 square miles. They don't have the personnel to be doing grave openings, to be mowing these cemeteries, to be treating the cemetery in a way that they need to be treated and to operate. And you say, okay, now you have to take over 3 cemeteries in your municipality. I mean, those are tremendous burdens that are being passed on to the localities with really no support. So that is a big concern. The chairman of the State Cemetery Board at the last meeting, I was really pleased. He said publicly, we need to work with the association. This needs to be an issue that should be addressed, that we need more money in the fund.
Well, I want to pivot to some related death care issues. You mentioned, if I heard you correctly, organic decomposition, which I'll call human composting, something that was addressed in state law recently. There was the process of writing rules and regulations, some of which I know your organization weighed in on. Where do you think stand with that process, and is that something that's been available now to New Yorkers? And if so, is it being utilized at all?
So the regulations in the statute, because we're in New York and we like to make the regulations as robust as possible, which are pages long, have been challenging. But I think particularly
they're still being implemented.
No, they have been implemented.
Okay, I thought you were going to say they're still in the process.
No, they're finally implemented.
We talked about this 2 years ago.
So one of the bigger issues that I've had was I've toured all the facilities out west related to natural organic reduction. It's a very exciting job that I have, and really was not comfortable, particularly for a lot of the cemeteries that I represent, with the very institutional nature of how they were doing natural organic reduction. But some of them do it really well, and some of them not so much. And I thought we could learn a lot from that. And so we've been having conversations in the state and with other companies. And I think you're going to see a process, particularly the Wall Street Journal just did a great piece on Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. Which had indicated they're going to be putting in a natural organic reduction facility, but in a great marketplace. I think there are a lot of people in that area, I think, that would be very interested in this process. It's a beautiful cemetery. So they're going to start coming, and I think some of the additional pressure has been New Jersey passed an NOR law, so natural organic reduction law. Theirs is for-profit driven, and one of the big problems we have for New York nonprofits, who are the only ones that can operate these facilities, or cemeteries, is that that's not the case in other states. And so we see folks who have funeral chains in multiple states move bodies from New York and send them to New Jersey for cremation because they can do it in bulk. They'll store them up in trucks and send grandma and not disclose it to you that she's being cremated in New Jersey, and not following the same protections that we have in New York, where we have nation-leading body identification requirements and receipts and so forth. So there's a comfort level that people understand that your relative that went to the crematory is the relative that's coming back. And so those facilities and those chains are really, I think are going to be a challenge for New York, because they're going to try to undercut what we do in New York, but I think we're going to do it better.
And what about the state oversight of all of this work? Is the Department of State, which has the Division of Cemeteries in it, do they have a robust oversight and active role in New York, or could they approach this work differently or to a different degree?
No, I think they're pretty effective. They have a really good staff. They have a good mixture of seasoned employees and new folks. It's a very diverse state. I think they have regional offices, so I think they understand the differences between cemeteries. So if you have a New York City metropolitan cemetery that has, lots of money, professional staff that are full-time, that's really different than a small rural cemetery where you have volunteers who are, making up the board, and they've got PTA requirements, emergency services requirements, their parents, and they have jobs. And that's not to denigrate any of that, but that's what we see across most cemeteries in upstate New York. You're talking about volunteer-driven organizations. And, across the spectrum of just about everything in New York, we have a volunteer problem. And so these are nonprofit volunteer organizations, and 2% of the people in New York do 100% of the work. And so we're in a fight for those 2% of people who are going to be committed to the historical and cultural value of cemeteries in their community.
And what are you doing to try to attract that next generation of volunteers?
Well, and getting back to your question about the state has actually been partnering with the New York State Association of Cemeteries to do a Cemetery 101 class, as well as another program which is to adopt a cemetery, to get people in and volunteer, and to do training sessions on basically what does cemetery involvement look like. And so we've been partnering on those programs. They've been doing their own across the state. And I think they've been very successful, at least in helping us for some of the cemeteries that are in the border of being successful or being unsuccessful, and getting new people engaged in the board. In my family cemetery, where my generations of my family have been, it's the grandchildren of the people I remember being on the board are still on the board. So people are taking that commitment very seriously, but there's few people that want to do it. And I showed up at that board, their annual meeting, and I was the only guest. And so I think there's a need for continued engagement. Part of that's education, and the state does play a role, and we've been pleased that they've been engaged.
Well, for more information on all of these topics, you can visit dos.ny.gov/cemeteries. We can also find information about Cemetery 101. We've been speaking with David Fleming. He's the Legislative Director of the New York State Association of Cemeteries. David, thanks for visiting us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's edition of the Capitol Press Room. For an insider take on what's happening in state government, check out our Dispatches from Planet Albany show, available wherever you get podcasts or at capitolpressroom.org.
Join us again for Capitol Press Room, a production of WCNY Connected, Syracuse.